Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. I'm so glad you could join me today for today's reading. We are reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and today we'll be reading chapters 29 and 30. So we have our copy here, Jules Verne's great 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Just to recap what's happened before, our heroes and Captain Nemo visited the oyster beds to find pearls of magnificent value and size, and they came across and of course this was, they called it Ceylon, which is what it was called back in the 1860s when this was written, and it is of course Sri Lanka now, and they uh, dive down in their suits that have been made specially for them, and they see all these wondrous things. They see a giant, they call it a giant clam, but it's an oyster that has a pearl as big as a like a basketball. It's just very large, and they don't disturb it. They just keep on going. They're going to let the oyster, let the pearl grow a little bit more, and as they're walking back to the Nautilus, to the dinghy that they got traveled from the Nautilus to this area, they see someone who is clearly a very poor native who is trying to do some pearl diving himself. It's not the season for pearl diving, but he clearly is in need of the money, and so he goes and does it, and runs afoul of a very large shark. So immediately, Captain Nemo pulls out a good dagger that he kept with him. He gave everyone daggers, except, of course, for Ned Land, who brought his harpoon with him. And he Captain Nemo attacks the shark and the basically kills the shark, saves the man. Ned Land assists. There was a scene where Captain Nemo is actually felled by the shark. He is actually knocked down, and the shark is about to attack him when Ned Land throws his harpoon and then hits him with enough force to distract him, and then Captain Nemo finishes him off. And once the shark is dead, they uh, take the man and they bring him back up to the surface. They put him back into his own boat and revive him, give him, resuscitate him. And the native is amazed at what has happened here. He has never seen people in these giant copper helmets that they wear when they go underwater. He has, they have these strange suits, and this is all very new and strange to him. And he thought he was going to die. And Captain Nemo hands him a small bag, a small pouch, and when he looks inside, he finds that it's filled with pearls. So, in our last chapter, we get to see not only does Captain Nemo, up to this point, he's always been very against people who live on land and against being on land himself, certainly. And then in this, we see him helping out a man who is clearly in need of financial help, saving his life, and then giving him some some valuable pearls. So we get to see another side of Captain Nemo in this chapter. Um, it's it's pretty multifaceted character. We're seeing different sides of him, which is nice. And then our once our heroes were back on board the Nautilus, the submarine went under the ocean and traveled to the Red Sea. And once in the Red Sea, of course, they're talking about, well, you're going to turn around and come back. But no, apparently there is, according to Captain Nemo, a passageway under the water to get out of the Red Sea. So that's where we ended it last time. And if you are ready, I know I am, we can start with chapter 29, entitled The Arabian Tunnel. On that same day, I recounted to Conseil and Ned Land that portion of the conversation which would most interest them. When I said that in 2 days we would be in the Mediterranean, Conseil clapped his hands, but the Canadian only shrugged his shoulders. An underwater tunnel, he cried, connecting the two seas? Who ever heard of such a thing? Ned, my friend, replied Conseil. Who had ever heard of the Nautilus? Nobody, but it existed all the same. So don't shrug your shoulders or try to brush off ideas just by claiming nobody's ever heard of them. We'll see, retorted Ned Land, shaking his head. But just remember, I'd give anything to be able to believe in this tunnel, and in fact, I pray to God that it does take us into the Mediterranean. That same afternoon, at 21 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, the Nautilus surfaced near and drew near the coast of Arabia. We sighted Jeddah, an important trading center for Egypt, Syria, Turkey, and India. I could clearly make out its houses, the ships moored to its docks, and the larger vessels which had to anchor further out. The sun was now quite low on the horizon and struck full on the houses of the town, bringing out their whiteness. Outside, several wood or reed cabins indicated where the Bedouins lived. Soon Jeddah disappeared in the evening shadows, and the Nautilus once again dove beneath the surface of the somewhat phosphorescent water. On the next day, February 10th, the Nautilus sighted several ships heading in the opposite direction and was once more obliged to cruise underwater. But at noon, the sea was found to be deserted, and we came back up to take our position. Accompanied by Ned and Conseil, I went up and sat on the platform. The shoreline off to the east could only be seen as a vague blur through the mist. We were leaning on the side of the dinghy and chatting about one thing and another, when Ned Land pointed out to sea and said, "Do you see something over there, Professor?" "No, Ned, but as you well know, my eyes aren't as good as yours." "Take a good look," Ned went on. "There, off the starboard bow. Can't you see something moving?" "Yes," I said after looking carefully. I could make out something long and black on the surface. "Another Nautilus?" asked Conseil. "No," answered the Canadian. "And unless I'm very mistaken, it's some sea animal." "Are there whales in the Red Sea?" asked Conseil. "Yes, but every now and then they're seen here." "But it isn't a whale," Ned Land continued, not losing sight of the object. "Whales and I are old friends, and I can tell them by the way that they move." "The Nautilus is heading that way," said Conseil. "In a little while we'll be able to know for sure what it is." And, in fact, this blackish object was soon only a mile away. It looked like a large reef stuck in mid-ocean. What was it? I had no idea. "Look, it's moving, it's diving!" cried Ned Land. "What in God's name is it? It hasn't got the forked tail of a whale, and its fins look like sawed-off legs." "That means," I said. "Now it's rolled over on its back," continued the Canadian, "with its mammaries in the air." "It is a mermaid," cried Conseil. "A real mermaid, begging monsieur's pardon." This word, mermaid, put me on the right track, and I realized that this animal belonged to that species from which had sprung the legends about mermaids, creatures which were half woman and half fish. "No," I said to Conseil, "it isn't a mermaid, but a strange animal of which only a few specimens remain in the Red Sea. It's a dugong." Order of Sirenia, division of Pisciforme, subclass of monodelphinians, class of mammals, subkingdom of vertebrates, replied Conseil. Once he had stated this, Conseil had nothing more to say. Meanwhile, Ned Land was still watching. His eyes burned with desire at the sight of the animal. He seemed all set to harpoon it. or even throw himself in the water and attack it in its own element. "Oh, monsieur," he said in a trembling voice, "I've never killed that kind of critter." All his harpooner's soul was contained in this one phrase. Just then, Captain Nemo appeared on the platform. He noticed the dugong and, realizing how the Canadian felt, said, "If you were holding a harpoon right now, Master Land, I'll bet it would be burning right through your hand." "It certainly would, Captain." "Would you like to take up your old profession again for one day and add this creature to the list of fish you've already caught?" "There's nothing I'd like more." "Well then, go ahead and try." "Thank you, Captain," replied Ned Land, his eyes aflame. "Only you must promise not to miss it," the captain went on, "and I say that in your own interest." "Is a dugong dangerous when attacked?" I asked, in spite of the Canadian's shrug. "Yes," the captain replied. "Sometimes it turns on its attackers and capsizes their boat, but with Ned Land there's nothing to fear. His eye is sharp and his arm sure. I only advise him not to lose this dugong because it is rightly regarded as a fine food fish, and I know that Master Land does not dislike a good meal." "You mean to say," exclaimed the Canadian, "that in addition to everything else, this animal's good to eat?" "Yes, Master Land, its flesh is like real meat, and is held in high esteem. Throughout the East Indies it is reserved for princes. As a result, it's been so relentlessly hunted that, just like its close cousin the manatee, it's becoming rarer and rarer." "Well then, Captain," said Conseil gravely, "if by chance this one here is the last of its race, wouldn't it be better to spare him in the interests of science?" "Maybe," retorted the Canadian, "but in the interests of cooking it would be best to hunt him." "Go ahead then, Master Land," said Captain Nemo. Just then, 7 members of the crew, as mute and impassive as ever, came up on deck. One carried a harpoon and line of the type used by whalers. The dinghy was uncovered, taken from its niche and put to sea. 6 oarsmen took their places at the oars, and the coxswain took to the tiller. Ned, Conseil, and I got in and sat down in the stern. "Are you coming, Captain? Aren't you coming, Captain?" "No, monsieur, but I wish you good luck." The dinghy was shoved off and, propelled by its 6 oars, made rapid headway toward the dugong, which was then floating about 2 miles from the Nautilus. When we got about 500 yards away, the dinghy slowed down and its oars dipped noiselessly into the silent waters. Ned Land took up his harpoon and went up to stand in the bow of the boat. A whaler's harpoon is usually attached to a very long line, which unwinds rapidly as the wounded animal dives. This line, however, was no longer than 50 or 60 feet, and was attached at the other end to a little barrel which was intended to float and indicate the dugong's position. I stood up and took a close look at the Canadian's adversary. The dugong, which is also called the halicore, is somewhat similar to a manatee. It has an oblong body ending in a long tail, and its side fins are tipped with veritable fingers. It differs from the manatee in that its upper jaw is armed with 2 long and pointed teeth, which stick out on each side. The dugong Ned Land was preparing to attack was enormous. It must have been about 25 feet long. It wasn't moving and seemed to sleep on the surface. This would make it easier to capture. The dinghy cautiously approached to within 25 feet of the animal. The oars hung in mid-air. I rose to a crouching position. Ned Land was leaning back, brandishing the harpoon in his experienced hand. Suddenly, I heard a whistling noise, and the dugong disappeared. The harpoon had been thrown with great force, but it seemed only to have struck water. "Curses!" cried the Canadian in a rage. "I missed it!" "No," I said, "you wounded it. See, the blood over there. But your harpoon didn't stay in its body." "My harpoon! My harpoon!" cried Ned Land. The sailors started rowing again, and the coxswain steered the boat toward the floating barrel. Once the harpoon had been recovered, the dinghy once again set out after the dugong. From time to time it would come to the surface to breathe. Its wound had not weakened it, for it swam at great speed. The 6 oarsmen pulled with all their strength, and the dinghy flew across the sea in pursuit of the animal. Several times it got to within 20 or 25 feet, but then the dugong would suddenly dive and disappear again. One can imagine Ned Land's anger. He was shouting at the poor creature with all the worst swear words in the English language. As for me, I was merely disappointed that the animal was able to thwart us at every turn. We chased it without stopping for an hour, and I had begun to think it would be almost impossible to capture it, when this animal got the unfortunate idea of getting his revenge. This was to be his downfall. He turned on the dinghy and got ready to attack. This maneuver did not escape the Canadian's attention. "Watch out!" he cried. The coxswain said several words in their strange language, undoubtedly warning the men to be on their guard. The dugong came within 20 feet of the dinghy, stopped, and sniffed the air with its huge nostrils. Then it started moving again and rushed headlong in our direction. The dinghy could not avoid the blow. We were almost capsized, and the dinghy shipped a ton or two of water, which had to be bailed out. We had been saved from actually going over by the coxswain's skill in maneuvering, so that we were struck at an angle and not full on the side. Ned Land was clinging to the bow and harpooning the giant animal again and again as it sunk its teeth into the gunwale and lifted the boat out of the water like a lion attacking a deer. We were thrown on top of one another, and things might have ended badly if the Canadian, carrying on the struggle relentlessly, had not finally struck the animal in the heart. I could hear a grinding of teeth on the iron hull, and then the dugong disappeared, taking the harpoon with it. But soon the barrel came back to the surface, and a little later the animal's body also appeared floating on its back. The dinghy went over, took it in tow, and headed for the Nautilus. Very powerful pulleys had to be used to haul it up on the platform. It weighed 11,000 pounds. When it was cut up, the Canadian watched every detail of the operation. The same day at supper, the steward served me several slices of this meat, very well prepared by the cook on board. I found it excellent, and even better than veal, to say nothing of beef. On the next day, February 11th, the ship's galley was enriched by yet another delicate piece of game. A flock of terns had descended on the Nautilus and been caught. They were a species called Sterna nilotica, found only in Egypt, and had a black beak, a gray pointed head, white dots around their eyes, grayish-black wings and tail, white stomach and throat, and red feet. We also captured a few dozen Nile ducks, which make an excellent dish. These birds have white heads and necks, and the rest of their body is covered with black spots. The Nautilus had reduced its speed. It moved as if it were just out for a stroll, so to speak. I observed that the water of the Red Sea became less and less salty as we drew near Suez. Toward 5 in the afternoon, we sighted Cape Ras Mohammed, which forms the tip of the Arabian Petrea. That portion of land between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. The Nautilus then entered Jubal Straits, leading to the Gulf of Suez. I could see clearly a high mountain dominating the land between the two gulfs. It was Mount Horeb, or Sinai, on which Moses saw God face to face, and which one always imagines sheathed in lightning. The Nautilus continued cruising alternately on the surface and underwater, and at 6 o'clock we passed Tor, situated inside a bay whose waters seemed tinted with red, a phenomenon Captain Nemo had mentioned earlier. Then night came on in the midst of a heavy silence, occasionally broken by the cry of a pelican, by the crash of surf on rocks, or by the far-away panting of a steamer as its paddle wheels struck the water with a resounding splash. From 8 to 9 o'clock the Nautilus cruised only a short distance below the surface. According to my calculations, we were probably very near Suez. Through the panels in the lounge I could see the rock walls brightly illuminated by our electric light. It seemed as if the gulf were getting narrower and narrower. At 9:15 the boat returned to the surface, and I went up on deck. I was very impatient to go through Captain Nemo's tunnel. I could not sit still, and had to come up and take a breath of fresh night air. Soon I could make out through the darkness a pale light, half discolored by the mist, shining about a mile away. "A floating beacon," someone near me said. I turned around and recognized the captain. It's the floating beacon of Suez," he went on. "It won't be long now before we're at the mouth of the tunnel." "It must be rather difficult to enter." "Yes, it is. That is why I stay at in the helmsman's compartment during the entire operation. And now, if you would kindly go below, Monsieur Aronnax. The Nautilus is going to dive and will not resurface again until we have gone through the Arabian Tunnel." I followed Captain Nemo. The hatch closed, the reservoirs filled with water, and the submarine dove to a depth of 30 or 35 feet. "Professor," he said, "would you like to keep me company in the helmsman's compartment?" "I would be very flattered," I answered. "Come, then. You will be able to see everything of this trip. That will take us both underwater and under land." Captain Nemo led me toward the central companionway. Halfway up he opened a door, went down the upper gangways, and finally entered the helmsman's compartment, which, as the reader already knows, was situated on the forward part of the platform. It was a cabin about 6 feet square, and more or less resembling the bridges on Mississippi and Hudson steamboats. In the middle, it was a vertical wheel connected to the rubber chains running to the stern of the ship. 4 portholes made of lens-like glass, one in each wall, permitted the helmsman to see in all directions. Once my eyes became accustomed to the darkness in the compartment, I could make out the helmsman, a powerfully built man, gripping the rim of the wheel. Outside, the sea was brilliantly lit by the searchlight behind us at the other end of the platform. "Now," said Captain Nemo, "let's find the tunnel." Electric wires ran between this compartment and the engine room, thus permitting the captain to communicate directly. He pressed a metal button, and immediately the engines slowed down considerably. I looked out in silence at the high, sheer wall, the solid rock base of the sandy mountains on the coast, near which we were traveling. We followed it for an hour, only a few feet away. Captain Nemo did not take his eyes off the compass installed inside the cabin. At a mere gesture from him, the helmsman would instantly alter his course. I had taken my place at the port window, and I could make out magnificent coral foundations, zoophytes, and seaweed, and from cracks in the rock I could see crustaceans waving their enormous claws. At 10:15 Captain Nemo took the wheel. A large gallery, black and deep, opened up before us. The Nautilus boldly entered it. A strange rumbling could be heard on either side. It was the sound of the water rushing down the sloping tunnel from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. In spite of the fact that the engines had been reversed to counteract the force of this current, the Nautilus shot forward like an arrow. Along the narrow walls of the tunnel, I could make out nothing but brilliant streaks, straight furrows of fire created by our speed and the strong electric light. My heart was beating fast, and I brought my hand to my chest in order to calm it. At 10:35, Captain Nemo left the wheel, turned toward me, and said, "The Mediterranean." The Nautilus had been carried along by the current at such speed that it had crossed the Isthmus of Suez in less than 20 minutes. Chapter 30. The Greek Islands. At dawn of the next day, February 12th, the Nautilus once again came to the surface. I rushed up to the platform. 3 miles to the south, I could make out the vague outline of Pelusium. Our passage through the tunnel had been easy, but the current carrying us along had been so strong as to make it impossible to go back through this tunnel in the other direction. At about 7 o'clock, I was joined by Ned and Conseil. These two inseparable companions had slept soundly without giving a thought to the extraordinary thing the Nautilus had done. "Well, Professor," asked the Canadian in a slightly mocking tone, "what about the Mediterranean?" "We're in it, Ned, my friend." "What?" said Conseil. "You mean to say that during the night—" "Yes, during the night we crossed this uncrossable isthmus in a matter of minutes." "I don't believe it," replied the Canadian. "Well, you better, Ned," I said. "That land you see to the south is the coast of Egypt." "Go tell that to the Marines," retorted the stubborn Canadian. "But if Monsieur says so," replied Conseil, "it must be true." "Moreover, Ned, the captain did me the honor of letting me stay in the helmsman's compartment while he himself steered the Nautilus through this narrow tunnel. Do you hear that, Ned? And with eyes like yours, Ned," I added, "you ought to be able to make out the jetties of Port Said stretching out into the sea." The Canadian looked carefully. "Yeah, you're right, Professor," he said. "Your captain's an extraordinary man. There's no doubt about it. We're in the Mediterranean. All right, then, let's have a little chat and make sure no one can overhear us." I knew what it was the Canadian wanted to discuss, and I thought it best to let him get it off his chest. So the three of us went to sit by the searchlight where we would be less exposed to the wet spray of the waves. "All right, Ned, we're listening," I said. "What is it?" "It's very simple," replied the Canadian. "We're in Europe, and I want to leave the Nautilus before Captain Nemo's whims take us to faraway Arctic seas or back to the South Pacific." As always, this kind of discussion with the Canadian put me in an embarrassing spot. I did not want to deprive my companions of their freedom, and yet I had no desire to leave Captain Nemo. Thanks to him and his submarine, day by day I grew nearer to completing my studies of underwater life, and I was rewriting my book on the ocean depths in the midst of the very place I was describing. Where would I ever find another opportunity like this to observe the wonders of the ocean? Nowhere. I therefore had no desire to leave the Nautilus before our investigations had been completed. "Tell me frankly, Ned," I said, "are you bored on board? Do you regret the stroke of fate that threw you into Captain Nemo's hands?" The Canadian did not answer for a few moments. He then crossed his arms and said, "Frankly, I don't regret having made this trip beneath the seas. I'll be happy to have done it, but in order to have done it, it has to end. That's the way I feel about it." "It'll come to an end, Ned." "Where and when?" "I don't know where. As to when, I couldn't say. I can only suppose that it will come to an end when the seas have nothing more to teach us. Everything that begins has to come to an end." "I agree with Monsieur." said Conseil, and it seems very possible that after we've covered all the Earth's seas, Captain Nemo will let us loose. Loose? He's more likely to put us in a noose, cried the Canadian. Let's not exaggerate, Ned, I said. We have nothing to fear from the captain, but I still don't agree with Conseil. We know the secrets of the Nautilus, and I can't imagine its commander is going to let us go and thereby risk having them spread all over the world. So what do you think will happen? Asked the Canadian. We'll get an opportunity sometime. If not now, then maybe in 6 months. Ha! Exclaimed Ned Land. Could you please tell us where we'll be in 6 months, Professor? Perhaps here, perhaps in China. You know how fast the Nautilus can travel. It crosses oceans like a swallow flying through the air, or like an express train traveling over continents. It doesn't even avoid regions full of shipping. Who is to say it won't go near France, England, or America, where we would have as good a chance of escaping as here? Monsieur Aronnax, answered the Canadian, there's one thing wrong with all your reasoning. You're talking in the future. We'll be here, or we'll be there. I'm talking about right now. We're here, and we should take advantage of it. I felt hard-pressed by Ned Land's logic and close to defeat. I no longer knew what arguments to use. Monsieur, Ned continued, even though it's impossible, let's say that Captain Nemo offered you your freedom today. Would you accept it? I don't know, I replied. And if he added that the offer would never be renewed, would you accept then? I did not answer. What does my friend Conseil think? Your friend Conseil has nothing to say, he answered calmly. He has no interest whatsoever in the whole matter. He is a bachelor, just like his master and his comrade, Ned. He has no wife, relations, or children waiting for him at home. He is in the service of Monsieur, and he thinks like Monsieur. He talks like Monsieur, and, to his great regret, he can't be counted on to make a majority. Only two people are confronting each other here, Monsieur and Ned. Conseil is here to listen and keep score. I could not help smiling at the way Conseil effaced his own personality. Ned must have been delighted at heart not to have him as an adversary. Well then, Monsieur, said Ned Land, since Conseil doesn't exist, let's discuss the matter between the two of us. I spoke my piece and you heard me. What's your answer? I obviously had to say something, and I did not like the idea of trying to dodge the issue. Well, Ned, I said, here's my answer. You're right, and my arguments can't stand up to yours. We can't rely on Captain Nemo's goodwill. The most elementary caution would prevent him from letting us go. So we must be on the lookout to take advantage of the first opportunity we get to leave the Nautilus. Good, Monsieur Aronnax. But let me say one thing, I added. The opportunity must be a good one. Our first attempt has to succeed. If it doesn't, we won't get another chance, and Captain Nemo won't forgive us. That's right, replied the Canadian. But what you say applies to any attempt we make, whether it's in 2 years or 2 days. And that means there's only one thing to keep in mind. If the right opportunity comes along, we have to take it. Agreed. But just tell me, Ned, what you mean by the right opportunity? It'll come when the Nautilus gets near the coast of Europe on some dark night. Would you try swimming? Yes, if it were near enough to the shore and if the submarine were on the surface. But not if we were far from shore or the submarine underwater. What would you do in that case? I try and get a hold of the dinghy. I know how to sail it. We'll get inside it, unfasten it, and rise to the surface. And since it's behind the helmsman's compartment, he wouldn't even see us. All right, Ned. Keep an eye open for such a chance, and don't forget that we're lost if we don't succeed. I won't forget it, monsieur. And now, Ned, do you want to know what I think about your plans? What, Monsieur Aronnax? Well, I don't say that I hope, that this opportunity will never come up. Why not? Because Captain Nemo can't possibly believe that we've given up all hope of regaining our freedom, and he'll be on his guard, especially when we're near the coast of Europe. I agree with Monsieur, said Conseil. We'll see, replied Ned Land, shaking his head with an air of determination. Now, Ned, I added, let's leave it there. Not another word about all this. The day you're ready to go, tell us, and we'll follow you. I leave it completely up to you. Thus ended this conversation, which was to have such serious consequences later on. But I must add that at the moment events seemed to confirm my predictions, to the Canadians' great disappointment. Was Captain Nemo afraid of what we might do in these waters, or did he merely want to stay out of sight of the many ships sailing in the Mediterranean? I have no idea, but most of the time we cruised underwater and far from any shore. The Nautilus would either come up only far enough for the helmsman's compartment to appear above the surface, or else it would dive to great depths. I only knew, for instance, that we were passing Carpathos Island, one of these Sporades, because of the line of Virgil that Captain Nemo quoted as he put his finger on the map. In the Carpathian Sea lives Proteus, dark prophet of Neptune. It had, in fact, been the dwelling place of Proteus, the shepherd of Neptune's flocks, and it was situated between Rhodes and Crete. I saw only its granite foundations through the glass panels of the lounge. On the next day, February 14th, I had resolved to spend several hours studying the fish of the Greek islands, but for some reason the panels remained completely closed. On checking the Nautilus's direction, I realized that it was heading for Candia, the ancient Isle of Crete. When I had boarded the Abraham Lincoln, this island had just risen up against its Turkish tyrants. But of what had happened since, what had since happened, there we go, to this insurrection, I had absolutely no idea. And Captain Nemo, cut off as he was from all communication with dry land, was not the man who could inform me. I therefore did not even mention this when I found myself alone with him that night in the lounge. Moreover, he was silent and seemed preoccupied. Then, contrary to his usual custom, he ordered the panels to be opened and started pacing back and forth between them, carefully observing the surrounding sea. Why? I could not imagine, and contented myself with studying the fish that passed before my eyes. Among others, I noticed certain species of goby, mentioned by Aristotle. It is called a rockling, and is particularly frequent in the salt water near the Nile Delta. Near them were swimming some semi-phosphorescent schnappers, a sparoid fish which the Egyptians classed among their sacred animals, and whose arrival in the Nile announced the arrival of the flood season, and was greeted with religious ceremonies. I also noticed some foot-long chiline, a bony fish with transparent scales and pale coloration accentuated by red spots. They eat large quantities of marine plants, which give them an excellent taste. As a result, they were much sought after by the gourmets of ancient Rome, and their entrails, cooked with soft roe of moray, peacock brains, and flamingo tongues, made a dish which delighted the Emperor Vitellius. It was then noticed another inhabitant of these seas, which brought back yet more memories of what I had learned about classical times. It was the remora, which often attaches itself to the bellies of sharks. According to ancient writers, it could stop a ship by sticking to its hull, and it was said that one of these remora had held back Antony's ship in the Battle of Actium, and thereby helped Augustus gain his victory. On how little hangs the destiny of nations. I also observed marvelous Antheas belonging to the order of Lutinidae. The Greeks considered them sacred and claimed they had the power to chase off sea monsters. Their name comes from the word for flower, and it is well justified by their shimmering shades of red, going from light pink to deep ruby color, as well as by the slightly mottled effect of their dorsal fin. I could not take my eyes off these wonders of the sea, but then suddenly I was thunderstruck by an unexpected apparition. A man had appeared in the midst of the water, a diver carrying a small leather bag attached to his belt. It was not a body floating in the water. It was a live man swimming vigorously, disappearing from time to catch his breath at the surface. I turned to Captain Nemo and said excitedly, "A man drowning! We must save him!" The captain came over to the window without saying a word. The man drew nearer, and he was now looking at us with his face pressed against the glass. To my complete amazement, Captain Nemo motioned to him. The diver answered with a wave of his hand and then immediately went back to the surface. He did not reappear. "Don't worry," said the captain. "That's Nicholas from Cape Matapan. They call him the Fish. He's well known throughout the Cyclades. A marvelous diver. Water is his element, and he lives in it more than he does on land, constantly going back and forth from one island to another, and even to Crete." "Do you know him, Professor?" "Why shouldn't I, Monsieur Aronnax?" With this, Captain Nemo went over to a bureau beside the left-hand window of the lounge. Near it I noticed a steel-banded chest with a brass plaque on the lid bearing the monogram of the Nautilus with the motto, Mobilis in Mobile. Then, without taking any notice of my presence, the captain opened the bureau, which turned out to be a kind of strong box containing ingots. They were ingots of gold. Where did it come from, this precious metal worth such a vast amount? Where had the captain gotten this gold, and what was he going to do with it? I didn't say a word. I just looked, and the captain took out the ingots one by one and placed them neatly in the chest, which was soon filled to the top. I estimated that it contained more than 200 pounds of gold, or, in other words, an amount worth about $1 million. The chest was securely fastened, and on its lid the captain wrote an address in letters which must have been Greek. He then pressed a button communicating with the crew's quarters. 4 men appeared and, not without some difficulty, pushed the chest out of the room. I could soon hear them lifting it up the companionway by means of pulleys. Then Captain Nemo turned toward me and asked, "You were saying, Professor?" "I wasn't saying anything, Captain." "Then, with your permission, monsieur, I shall wish you good night." And with that, Captain Nemo left the room. I went to my room, very puzzled, as one might well imagine. I tried in vain to sleep. I attempted to find some relationship between the appearance of the diver and the chest filled with gold. Soon I felt the ship rolling and pitching, and realized that the Nautilus had surfaced. Then I heard the sound of steps on the platform. I realized the dinghy was being unfastened and put to sea. It knocked against the Nautilus for a moment, and then all noise ceased. 2 hours later I heard the same noises, the same goings and comings. The dinghy was hauled on board, refastened in its place, and the Nautilus once again dove under the water. So all this gold had been taken someplace. Where? With whom was the Captain Nemo in communication. The next day I told Conseil and Ned what happened. My companions were no less surprised than I. "But where'd he get all this gold?" asked Ned Land. I had no answer to that question. After lunch I went to the lounge and started working. Till 5 in the afternoon I was busy drawing up my notes. Then, suddenly, I thought at the time it might have been due to some personal indisposition, I felt very hot and had to take off my business coat. This was very strange, as we were not in the tropics, and besides, with the Nautilus submerged, we should have been insulated against the outside climate. I looked at the pressure gauge. It indicated a depth of 60 feet, or, in other words, beyond reach of atmospheric heat. I continued working, but soon the temperature had risen to the point of being almost unbearable. Could it be there's a fire on board? I thought. I was about to leave the lounge when Captain Nemo entered. He went over to the thermometer and said, 108. "I don't doubt it, Captain," I replied. "And if it gets any hotter, we won't be able to stand it." "Professor, it won't get any hotter unless we want it to." "Can you change it at will?" "No, but I can go farther from the area producing it." "You mean to say it's coming from outside?" "Yes, we are cruising through a current of boiling water." "How is that possible?" I cried. "Look." The panels opened, and I could see that the ocean around us was completely white. Steaming, sulphurous fumes were bubbling up through the sea, which was boiling like water in a pot. I touched one of the panes of glass, but it was so hot I immediately had to remove my hand. "Where are we?" I asked. "Near Santorin Island, Professor," replied the captain. "And to be more precise, in the channel separating Nea Calmini and Pelea Calmini. I wanted to show you the strange spectacle of an underwater volcanic eruption." I thought that the formation of these new islands was finished. "Nothing is ever finished in volcanic areas," answered Captain Nemo, "and the earth is continually being altered by underground fire. Already, in the year 19 of our era, according to Cassiodorus and Pliny, a new island called Thea appeared at the same place as these more recently formed little islands. Later, it sank beneath the surface, only to reappear in the year 69, and then sink once more. From that period till now, the area was calm. But on February 3, 1866, a new island called George Island emerged in the midst of sulphurous vapors near Nea Calmini, and then became joined to it on the 6th of that same month. 7 days later, on February 13th, the island of Aphroisia appeared, leaving a 30-foot channel between it and Nea Calmini. I was in these waters when it happened, and I was able to observe all the various phases. Aphroisia was a round island about 300 feet in diameter and 30 feet in height. It was composed of black vitreous lava mixed with feldspar. Finally, on March 10th, a yet smaller island called Rika appeared next to Nea Calmini, and then the three became fused together, forming one entire island. "Are we in one of those channels now?" I asked. "This one," replied Captain Nemo, pointing to a chart of the area. "As you can see, I've drawn in the new islands." "But will this channel also be filled one day?" "Probably, Monsieur Aronnax, for since 1866, 8 little lava islands have arisen in front of the port of St. Nicholas and Pelea Calmini. It is therefore obvious that Nea and Pelea Calmini will soon be joined. Whereas it's microscopic animals that form islands in the Pacific, here it's volcanic action. Look, monsieur, you can see it going on right now beneath the surface. I went back to the glass panel. The Nautilus was no longer moving. The heat was becoming unbearable. There was some iron salt in the water, turning it from white to red. In spite of the lounge being hermetically sealed, it was becoming filled with an unbearable smell of sulfur, and outside, scarlet flames shone brighter than the electric light. I was covered with perspiration. I was stifling. I was being cooked alive. Yes, I really felt as if I were being cooked alive. We can't stay much longer in the midst of this boiling water, I said to the captain. No, it wouldn't be wise, Captain Nemo answered calmly. An order was given. The Nautilus veered off and drew away from this dangerous furnace. A quarter of an hour later, we were breathing freely on the surface. The thought came to me that if Ned Land had chosen to escape in these waters, we would not have come out of this sea of fire alive. On the next day, February 16th, we quit that basin which, between Rhodes and Alexandria, goes down to depths of 10,000 feet, and the Nautilus, cruising past Cerigo Island and Cape Matapan, left the Greek islands. And we'll leave it at that. That is chapters 29 and 30 for today. When we are back, I hope you have a very good weekend. And when we're back on Monday at 4 p.m., we will read the next two chapters of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. I really hope you can join me for that, and hopefully you're reading along and taking part in this as well. Thank you very much. We'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone.